The island of Great Britain, 410 AD. The Emperor Honorius sent a letter to the cities of Great Britain telling them to look to their own defenses. This was a moment considered by many historians to officially end Roman rule on the island of Great Britain. Of course, it's an open question how much Roman power really was left in the island at that point, and this is really the question before us. Did Roman Britain collapse with one letter sent by the emperor in 410, or alternatively, was the end of Roman rule a longer story of abandonment, uprisings of local violence and usurpations, and ultimately a kind of merger of the remains of Roman culture with the emergent peoples, both already on the island, but also those who were migrating there from the sea? We tackle the end of Roman rule in Great Britain on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 104, The End of Roman Britain. So, as I alluded to in the introduction, I don't want to present the fall of Roman Britain as precipitated by a single event in 410, as though the letter from the Emperor Honorius suddenly ended 4 centuries of Roman rule in Great Britain. The better argument is this, that Roman Britain fell because the imperial state gradually lost the ability to perform essential functions that were characteristic of Roman rule: defense, taxation, the administration of law, governance, supplying a stable monetary system, and also the patronage system of Roman elite. Ultimately, British communities rejected imperial rule because imperial rule did not really function for many communities. So the letter that Honorius sent in 410 was more a legal and symbolic recognition of a political reality that had already come into existence in the final decades of the 300s and into the early 400s AD. So let's go ahead and talk about this. Historians are puzzled and have plenty to disagree about when it comes to thinking about how Great Britain transitioned away from Roman rule. It is archaeologically difficult to interpret the finds from this period. There are also written sources which outline some of the events in Great Britain at the end of Roman rule. Some of them disagree with each other, some of them are fragmentary, but there is a roughly coherent outline, and the story that emerges from the literary sources, at least, is that Britain was drawn repeatedly into civil wars. The legions that were stationed in Britain were gradually pulled away to deal with more urgent crises. The security in various regions and cities in the island ended up arming themselves and defending themselves, and eventually Roman officials were even expelled, supposedly. It's important to also remember that Britain was, from the very beginning of Roman rule, a frontier. It was a military frontier, really. So it was a province that paid taxes and provided soldiers, but it was also, by virtue of being on the periphery, a place that was friendly to usurpers. And we really see that pattern in the 4th century. Constantine the Great, if you'll remember from the episodes on him, got his initial start when his father died on the island of Great Britain, and he himself launched his successful takeover of the entire Roman Empire from Great Britain. But Constantine was really the last of the winners from Great Britain. There are a series of other usurpers in the 4th century that attract the soldiers of Great Britain and its political elites. Those usurpations usually resulted in losses, and the result was frequent political instability and the weakening of Britain's defenses. The first of these episodes that I want to talk about starts in 383 AD. In that year, Magnus Maximus, commander in Britain, took troops across the English Channel to Gaul, and he challenged the imperial government. He defeated the Roman Emperor Gratian, and for a time, Magnus was able to control both Great Britain and Gaul, but within 5 years, in 388, he was defeated by the emperor that united the Roman Empire for the last time, Theodosius I. Okay, so what? It's just a usurpation. But what I want to highlight here is that this is one of many examples at the end of Roman rule where the army stationed on the island was not used to defend the island. It was converted instead into an instrument to be used by a usurper. And each time this happened from the 380s onward, Britain's security was reduced and it was exposed to external attack. Britain, if you'll remember, is an island, so it could easily be invaded by sea. The other thing to remember about Great Britain is that the Romans did not fully conquer it. There were Picts and Scots in the north. Saxons were raiding on the eastern and southern coasts. And when they coordinated together, either within these groups or sometimes with agreements made among various groups, the effects were pretty overwhelming. I mentioned a few episodes ago what happened in 367 and 368, where Picts and Scots and Saxons and probably deserters from the Roman military conspired together to effectively loot the entire island of Great Britain over the course of a year. So every time I talk about a usurpation in Great Britain and the use of British troops to go and attack some other part of the Roman Empire, remember that this left the island exposed. And when Theodosius died in 395, the island of Great Britain was effectively ceded to the governance of Stilicho, and we met Stilicho. He was the Magister Militum, the chief military commander of the Western Roman Empire and its emperor, Honorius. Honorius was, at this point, a child. Stilicho actually came to Great Britain between the years 396 and 399 to campaign in the north and on the east against the Picts, the Scots, and the Saxons. He secured a victory, but before he could consolidate his gains, the issues with the Goths back in Italy forced him to withdraw from the island of Great Britain, bringing a bunch of his soldiers with him. And by the way, he didn't just take the soldiers he brought, he took some of the legions that were stationed already and had been garrisoned for some time in Great Britain. So the point here is that the survival of Italy was more important to Stilicho than the security of Great Britain. Britain was important, of course. Stilicho came there, but it was never going to be more important than Italy. And the empire clearly did not have sufficient resources, even the diminished Western Empire, to hold all of its territory. So it had to accept trade-offs, that in order to secure Italy, Great Britain had to be left vulnerable. Fundamentally, the Western Roman Empire was overstretched. The demands for troops and fleets and frontier intelligence and the defense of the British coast, all of this just simply could not compete with more urgent crises in Italy, in Gaul, in Spain, and along the Rhine. So the idea here is not that the imperial government just decided to leave Britain reflectively. It just did not have the capacity to hold Britain while also fighting for survival in those more central provinces. During the same time, we see in the archaeological evidence that the social order in Britain was already changing. There were in Britain Roman villas and townhouses and mosaics and dining rooms and silver. There were elites who were patrons, very wealthy elites, in fact, people who were politically connected to the imperial administration. These were the people who made governance in Great Britain work. They were also the makers and the propagators of elite culture, and especially Roman culture in Great Britain. And we find plenty of evidence for these elite in Great Britain during Roman occupation, but by the late 4th century, many of the most characteristically Roman features of the archaeology related to Roman elites clearly contracts. The major administrative towns of Great Britain decline in their size and their scale. The archaeological record shows fewer and fewer urban townhouses, and those that remain become smaller. A few of the largest villas in Great Britain appear to have survived, while the smaller and medium-sized villas gradually disappeared. What do we say is going on here? Well, I think that wealth was probably being concentrated, that those who were capable of building sort of quasi-independent communities just by virtue of sheer wealth and having vast amounts of tenant farmers or slaves, I think those villas were able to survive, even for many decades after Roman rule officially ended. One of the other signs in the archaeological record from the late 400s, from the late 300s and early 400s is what appear to be squatters. That is, many of the grand spaces in Roman towns and Roman villas, places where there were ornate mosaics. There are signs that rougher, simpler occupation styles pervaded in those spaces. That could mean that those areas were abandoned or taken over by outsiders. It could also mean that the original owners or the descendants of the original owners were nowhere near as wealthy as they once were or as their ancestors once were. The most dramatic change in the archaeological record, though, is with the coinage. We just do not see much Roman coinage in Great Britain after coins issued between 395 and about 402. Now, I don't think that that means that coinage just vanished overnight. There are Roman silver coins that are clipped that were found in Great Britain. These coins are probably just being used for decades after the Romans left. But almost certainly there is a kind of self-sufficiency happening with the coin that remains in Roman Britain. It is being valued in different ways than it would be if there was an official Roman government in charge. And there probably are not Roman officials there to tax in nominal money. And again, all of this is happening or appears to be happening in the archaeological record prior to 410, prior to the moment when we get a kind of official declaration that the towns of Roman Britain should just defend themselves. But let's look at what happens in those final years. I mentioned the usurpation of Magnus in 383, which was finally put down in 388. In 406, we had another really important moment in the political history of Roman Great Britain. In that year, Vandals, Alans crossed the Rhine River and they entered Gaul. The British army were actually worried about barbarians, so-called, crossing the English Channel from Gaul into Great Britain. And in order to defend themselves, it didn't make sense to look to the imperial government. It instead made sense to look to local rulers. And so this is when a series of usurpers arise in Great Britain, probably to defend that province. The first of these was a man named Marcus. He was killed. Then there was a British ruler, a member of the urban aristocracy. His name was Gratian. He was murdered by his own soldiers after just 4 months of rule. Then there was a man named Constantine, or who at least called himself Constantine, and common soldiers flocked to him, we're told by the sources, because of his name. Constantine, the name, had a lot of cachet in Great Britain. If you think about it, this is happening in 406. When did Constantine come to power in York? That happened in 306. So it was exactly a 100-year anniversary. And it's probably no accident that a man calling himself Constantine sort of showed up on the scene in Britain exactly 100 years after Constantine the Great. It was probably done on purpose. And the British army made him emperor. And Constantine, who we'll call Constantine III, even though he's not related to Constantine's family, Well, he crossed over into Gaul with British forces. The point was securing the coast of the English Channel and to take over some territory from the Western Roman Empire in Gaul. And he could argue that this was a defensive move. He was just protecting Britain from invasion. But the effect on the island of Great Britain was actually to make it more exposed, because the remaining effective field forces left the island with him. And then Constantine became entangled in continental politics. He fought other Romans. He tried to make alliances with some of the invaders, tried to take part of Spain, and then eventually was betrayed by his own general. And when all of that happened and he died in 411 and was executed, his soldiers had been taken far away from Great Britain and they never returned. So Britain lost its army when Constantine III failed in his attempt to basically make an empire for himself. And that's really the big turning point for me. It wasn't so much then that Britain was left undefended by the central state. Really, its own usurpers took the defenders of Great Britain into the Roman Empire in these sort of selfish attempts to take territory. And the imperial government simply was not going to send now very precious resources back to Great Britain in the power vacuum. So this left the island of Great Britain from about 408, 409, 410 exposed to Picts and Scots from the north and Saxons raiding on the eastern coast. And the central government still nominally demanded obedience and taxes and recognition, but it was not protecting the island at all. So at this point, Roman authority just lost legitimacy. The people of Great Britain chose then to defend their own cities, although I'm not sure what other choice they had. And maybe they expelled Roman officials, but my guess is there was some combination of Roman officials leaving the island to try to make it into parts of the Roman Empire, which were still under Roman government. And that is the context for Honorius's letter. So in Zosimus, who is a Byzantine Greek historian writing at the end of the 5th century and beginning of the 6th century, he reports a couple of things. First, quote, "The Britons took up arms and with no consideration of the danger to themselves, freed their own cities from barbarian threat." That's Zosimus, book 6. And then a little bit later in that book, Zosimus just says this, quote, "Honorius, however, wrote letters to the cities in Britain, urging them to defend themselves." Again, that's Zosimus, book 6. So Honorius wrote to the British cities telling them to look after their own defense. To me, it's interesting that the letter is addressed to the cities. It is not addressed to the normal provincial chain of command. What that suggests to me is that already the ordinary machinery of the Roman government, so the governors, the military commanders, officers, courts, they were not functioning at this point. Otherwise, the emperor would have written his letter to them. Instead, he's writing to locals who probably asked him for help, and he couldn't offer them an army. He could just send them a letter. And of course, this is written in 410. That shouldn't escape us either. We just talked about in the last episode the monumental event that happened in that year. Rome itself was sacked by the Goths and their leader, Alaric. Honorius was ruling the Roman Empire from Ravenna. He wasn't even willing to help Rome. So he's definitely not going to help the island of Great Britain. So the letter is meaningful, but again, it's not an automatic end. Changes were already happening prior to the letter, and they continued after the letter. Towns and villas and forts and coinage didn't just vanish in 410. There are numerous sites in Great Britain: Silchester, Bath, Exeter, Wroxeter, York, many others that show continuing activity well into the middle of the 5th century. Now, those sites are occupied. They are not governed by the Roman government. People were still there. Buildings were there. They were using coins. They were probably using them differently. And there were even elites that were trying to maintain an old form of life. It's just that the imperial structures that really helped underwrite Roman culture was not there. And over time, external security collapsed. Internal security just became more local. It became more private. Taxation broke down. There was really not a monopoly on force in Roman Britain. And in the place of those things, what rose was probably local strongmen or warlords. Some of them may have even been former Roman officials or landowners or even military commanders. They may have even used Roman titles. They were not out to destroy or pillage Roman buildings or even abolish Roman culture. They were just interested in securing local power in their area. So you could still have wealthy, maybe even Roman villa owners in 415 or 420 or 425, but the system that gave that person notability was gone. And so if that kind of person wanted to survive, he had to adapt. And I think that's what we see in the archaeological record. There was a kind of long failure and a gradual emergence of local power. The types of events that seem to have really precipitated this fall were the removal of Roman troops from Great Britain, sometimes by imperial officials like Stilicho, but often also by usurpers who took British soldiers across the English Channel for their own ambitious reasons. In the end, when Honorius told the British communities to defend themselves, he was really acknowledging a situation that had already come into being, that the imperial government had not been able to enforce its own presence in that area for some time. And instead, governance on the island was already adapting to a new reality. It was becoming more localized, more decentralized, more private, and in some ways more insecure. And I think in Roman Britain, we see kind of a microcosm of what happened in the Roman Empire in the West more generally. The Roman Empire did not fall because it was invaded, but because it could not protect itself. It was no longer seen as legitimate, and local societies or strongmen began to build new forms of power as the old forms of power fell into ruin.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocor. Follow Professor Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.